Good morning, friends. Thank you for coming to our panel, Religion, Violence, and the Moral Problem of Blackness. I'm very excited to have three distinguished scholars on this panel discussion. First, we have Lee Butler to my right. Professor Butler is Distinguished Service Professor of Theology and Psychology at Chicago Theological Seminary. As an African American pastoral theologian, he explores identity formation, African indigenous religions, American slavocracy, religiosity and spirituality, black and womanist theologies, psychological historiography, and health and healing. He's also played a major role within the Guild in terms of mentoring young students who are interested in African American religions. Also, we have a new colleague, Dr. Alfonso Seville. He's the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow for the Study of American Religion and Slavery at Georgetown University. Our first postdoctoral fellow within the Department of Theology at Georgetown. He's actually looking at slavery, Catholicism, and the sale of 272 slaves at Georgetown and teaching a special class within the department during the Problem of God session. And he's actually taking students over to the archives and showing them how to investigate and what kinds of questions to ask. So we're very excited to have him. He's here for the entire year. Next semester he won't teach, but he will put on a number of public seminars. So please keep a lookout for him. And finally, but not least, of course, is Dr. Suika Degas Kolbert. She is the chair of the Department of Performing Arts, director of Theater and Performance Studies, and professor of African American Studies and Theater and Performance Studies at Georgetown University. She's also an alum of Georgetown, so it's great to have her back. She's written a number of books and edited several books, including she's author of The African American Theatrical Body, Reception, Performance, and the Stage, and Black Movements, Performance, and Cultural Politics, which came out last year. She's also edited a great book on the the psychic terror of slavery within contemporary African American thought. And one of the reasons why I thought this panel might be very interesting is in part when we look at the major narratives of how people look at African American religion, it's often divided into this very neat camps of history and theology. And the historians are often trying to debate whether or not did the African gods die during the mid-Atlantic transatlantic slave trade, or did they remain alive? And in theology, the huge debate has been really around, well, how have African Americans used, particularly Christianity, as a tool for liberation? And what I think is interesting is that over the last, say, 20 years, people have begun to really challenge those two neat narratives as the only approaches to studying African American religions in the U.S. And what's interesting is that now people are really trying to dive into the text, to the archives, and look at the ways in which meaning making and knowledge development has occurred among African slaves, but also among contemporary African Americans who are using religion as a way to understand existence. And what is striking is we're finding more and more scholars are looking at the ways in which violence in particular and the whole legacy of slavery, which is often again, been marginal to discussions, and really the focus has been on this idea of from slavery to freedom. This idea to show how the American narrative of exceptionalism, right, in some ways allowed for slavery to emerge, but then also had the tools for slavery to actually end. And I think this panel really wants to disrupt that neat narrative and look at the ways in which violence, particularly violence exerted by Christians, is not only historical, right, but ongoing. And how then do we begin to make sense of that in terms of the text that we're using to understand religion, and particularly among people who have not been so keen on using doctrine as the only way to make sense of God and of tradition. And so one of the reasons why I want to include Professor Kolbert is in part because she's looking at literature, the body, and texts that we often see as marginal, but in fact have been very central to the formation of how we understand Black religion. But again, they've been marginal to the discussion. So I won't talk anymore. And for now, I would like to first begin with Professor Lee Butler, who's working on a major project on the psychological terror of slavery. And he'll begin with open remarks. Then we'll have Alfonso and then Suika.
Thank you very much. And I am very honored to be a part of this panel. Thank you for the invitation, and looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say. Well, Before I move into my full reflection, let me say that part of what I do is grounded in an interpretation and an understanding of the Atlantic world. And so with that, I move ahead. Religion is often violent. Religious violence results when one's orientation to another is expressed using violence. We have seen in countless and untold massacres that stipple the U.S. map and punctuate America's religious consciousness that violence is spiritual work and it's the voice of the faithful. Just as religion is a way of seeking and making meaning, violence has been the fundamental religious meaning-making system within American life. Violence in America has formed sacrificial rituals for finding salvation in this life and mediating between this life and the afterlife. Within the Christian heritage, the violence of the passion and the cross, the bodily suffering and death of Jesus, are justified with the words, "Under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." Violence is often religious. It's important to highlight that violence is more than impulsive, aggressive, victimizing actions. The violence of religion develops rituals that maintain constructed social relationships. Those rituals regularly adapt in order to maintain, in order to maintain the meaning that has been given to life. Child sacrifice, for example, is a ritual embedded in the Christian narrative. Although Jesus was an adult, he is always identified as the Son crucified. Child sacrifice is also embedded in North American culture. We first saw it on the auction blocks of American slavery. Slavocracy thought it not morally reprehensible to commodify black families and sell off the parts. So important is child sacrifice to the U.S., it has adapted and evolved into separating immigrant children from their parents. The destruction of family in the land that religiously stresses family values reveals the violence of religion. The ideology of making America safe again is no different from the scapegoating rituals that were developed to expiate sin. In this case, the scapegoating rituals are against the bodies believed to have contaminated the nation. Violence is embedded in and definitive of American life. The Atlantic world constituted the Americas as a European diaspora, a land of contact and conquest, telling the story of the Americas as the land of contact emphasizes the relational negotiations between Native Americans, Europeans, and African peoples. Telling the story of the Americas as the land of conquest emphasizes colonialism, which ignores the differing social histories of the three peoples and declares the discovery of the New World. This past Monday was the national holiday with two identifications: Indigenous Peoples Day, Contact, and Columbus Day, Conquest. The developmental history of the Americas cannot be told absent religion and violence. And due to the fact that the ideologies of contact and conquest were guided by religion and violence, interpreting the formation of the Americas ought not to be discussed in the absence of the bodies that interacted and were genocide. U.S. culture was established on the principle of religious freedom, framed by violence, and sustained by terrorism. Christianity supports this by identifying the body as the locus of moral ambiguity and the source of the moral problem. A favorite Christian text that reflects the negativity attributed to the body reads, "While we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord." This inclination to escape the body and to resist embodiment is deeply embedded in the Western Christian psyche. Our embrace of Pauline and patristic interpretations of the body have many crying out, "Oh, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death?" This body of death is regularly colorized with names like yellow fever and black plague. Revisiting or revising an excerpt from the children's church school song, "Red and yellow, black and white, all are not precious in America's sight." Black is perceived to be corrupt, bad, evil. Black bodies, therefore, are often perceived to be the problem in America. This locates black bodies on the margins of humanity and psychosocially ascribes black people to be aliens with an assigned task of becoming human. Unfortunately, the pathway to full humanity for Africans in America is fraught. If Americans are only able to see white bodies as goodness and whiteness as virtuous, then America will always show its love by hating the rainbow and elevating whiteness over our collective best interests. Once bodies were moralized and colorized with white and black attributions of good and evil, the problem of being surrounded by evil, feeling the constant pressure of evil, being seduced by the sensual power of evil, and the necessity of triumphing over evil were attributed to the black bodies of Africans. The violence within the spaces of contact and conquest are interpreted as righteous indignation, the preservation of the soul, and a holy war of light against darkness.
Thank you.
Good morning. So in an attempt to ground our conversation in the concrete realities of history, I'd like to reflect briefly on the Georgetown University's sale of 272 enslaved people in 1838. Faced with rising debt from capital improvements to campus and also the declining profitability of their farms in Maryland and Pennsylvania, Jesuit leaders made the decision to rid themselves of the burden of slave owning. In the years leading up to the sale, several proposals were considered. One of the leading proponents of the sale was then Professor Reverend James Ryder. In an 1835 address to the Roman Catholic congregation in Richmond, Virginia, Ryder laid out his pro-slavery rationale. Noting the historical persecution of Catholic communities at the hands of, quote, imperial tyrants such as the British, Ryder maintains the fidelity of Catholics to the law of the land cannot be misunderstood. Though both Catholic clergy and laity had been subjected to every species of oppression and injustice, Ryder assured his audience that he affirmed the resolution that the Society of Jesus would not interfere in matters between masters and their slaves in the southern states. Such interference would be deemed wicked, as it could undermine the peace of the flourishing nation. Supporters of abolition, remarked Ryder, were responsible for the religious fanaticism that had seduced rebel leaders like Nat Turner to rebellion and murder in nearby Southampton, Virginia, just 4 years ago. In 1836, 1 year after Reverend Ryder's address, the issue remained up for debate. In a memorandum recorded by Father Stephen Dubuisson, the pros and cons of the sale were listed. The burden of ownership posed a major obstacle to the spirituality of the Catholic Fathers. The maintenance of farms and enslaved laborers threatened not only to distract Jesuit clergy from the spiritual duties of prayer, study, and meditation, but Jesuit behavior was also corrupted by imitations of planters and business persons rather than Christ. Additionally, because of the presumed moral delinquency and cultural backwardness of the enslaved, Jesuit priests were obligated to utilize violence to maintain social order. Though not referenced explicitly, Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Southampton seemingly still lingered in the imaginations of the slave-owning community. Dubuisson notes that liberty would be a great disservice to the enslaved with respects to things temporal and spiritual. As he records, masters will be obligated to take severe measures, often with weapons in hands, to prevent or suppress uprisings among the blacks. We sense how odious will be all things our Father will have to do to cooperate with such measures. Already, it is moral burden enough for them to be forced to sometimes punish defiant slaves with the whip. The memo's primary justification for the use of violence echoes the rationale used by Ryder. That is, routine violence was necessary to quell potential violence of the enslaved black population. The fear of potential retributive violence by the enslaved community is the catalyst for the routine violence that is experienced in many plantations. In fact, Ryder maintains in his address that the institution of slavery and its attending anti-black violence was necessary for the stability of the fledgling nation's institutions. As Carol Anderson has argued in her best-selling book, White Rage, anti-black violence has long been excused in America because white violence, or white rage to use Anderson's terms, it is believed, counteracts exaggerated or anticipated episodes of violence enacted by African Americans. Ryder's assertion also underscores the ubiquity of racialized anti-black violence and its role in the institutional life of the early republic. Future Harvard University President Reverend Benjamin Wadsworth warned his congregation in Boston against denying servants life's basic necessities, such as food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention, but also instructed them to beat their slaves when they would not be corrected with words. Although anti-black violence was routine on college campuses throughout the early republic, it's the American church that provides the moral and theological justifications for such ungodly actions. Consequently, the moral problem of blackness in America is religious in its orientation.
So thank you for having me as a part of this conversation. Thank you to Terrence for inviting me. I have a slightly different point of entry as a scholar that focuses on culture, but I'm hopeful that some of my comments will wed nicely with what's already been said. As Terrence indicated, I co-edited a book called The Psychic Code of Slavery that is set in the late 20th century, and the basic premise of the volume answers two questions. Why can't Black people get over slavery? And why would they want to? And so the book enters into the late 20th century following a quote by Henry Louis Gates, where he says it's the best of times and it's the worst of times for Black people. You have the first Black president in the history of the United States, and you also have the highest levels of Black men incarcerated in the world. And so what does this inequality mean for how you might understand Black life in the late 20th century? And I think that this weds nicely with what Terrence said in his opening comments, because one of the conclusions we arrive at in the volume is that in the late 20th century, as a result of neoliberalism and as a result of the Civil Rights Acts, there's this emphasis on Black exceptionalism as the marker of Black ascension and the overcoming of disparity, whereas in thinking in that model, you don't really consider how the mass majority of not just Black people, but Americans more broadly are not able to access what we might understand as the American possibility. And so we think some about what it means to herald Obama as the fulfillment of civil rights longing in a context where you have so many Black people who are persistently and consistently disenfranchised. And so I wanted to give that little preface as an entry point to the more formal part of my paper, which is drawing from the new work that I'm working on currently on Lorraine Hansberry. The talk is taken from a chapter about a screenplay that she wrote right after Raisin in the Sun. Hansberry is most well known for her play Raisin in the Sun, which was the first play by a Black woman staged on Broadway. And so right after Raisin, she wrote a screenplay about slavery called The Drinking Gourd. And so that is what the talk is about. Soon after the premiere and fanfare of A Raisin in the Sun, NBC Studios commissioned Hansberry to write a play in honor of the centennial of the Civil War. The screenplay, titled The Drinking Gourd, tackled a question that she pondered since childhood: who and what a master might be. In an introduction to the play, Hansberry is quoted describing a trip she took to Tennessee to meet her maternal grandmother for the first time. She wrote, "My mother first took us south to visit her Tennessee birthplace one summer when I was 7 or 8. I woke up on the back seat of the car while we were still driving through some place called Kentucky, and my mother was pointing out to the beautiful hills and telling my brothers about how her father had run away and hidden from his master in those very hills when he was a little boy. She said that her mother had wandered among the wooded slopes in the moonlight and left food for him in secret places. They were very beautiful hills, and I looked out at them for miles and miles after that, wondering who and what a master might be." Hansberry's early experiences helped her to conceptualize what it meant to be a Black person outside of the structure of Jim Crow. Blackness did not present an impermeable barrier to opportunity or possibility, nor did it function to erode value or carry a historical stigma in Hansberry's mind. Instead of seeking to distance herself from the legacy of slavery, which was the predominant impulse in the mid-20th century, and we really don't get artists taking up en masse the issue of slavery until after the film The Roots in the 1970s. So in 1960, when Hansberry's writing this play, most artists are trying to distance themselves from the histories and legacies of slavery as a way to mark Blackness as something that's not denigrated. But instead of doing that, seeking to distance herself from the legacy of slavery and the Gone with the Wind degradation that typified popular understanding of the institution, she challenged renderings of Blackness in the mid-20th century through a sober depiction of the slave past. Her screenplay shows that those that exercise power to further systems of oppression become dehumanized in the process. And those systems, even with the stubborn efforts of power holders, will not necessarily last. Signaling the permanence of oppressive structures, Hansberry sets the drinking gourd on the cusp of the Civil War at a turning point in history. The drinking gourd tells the story of two overlapping families split apart by slavery. One family, the Sweets, finds itself facing the challenge to modernize their plantation to maximize profits. The other family, composed of the Sweets enslaved, uses every resource at its disposal to challenge the institution of slavery through the daily maintenance of the plantation. As is the case with most depictions of the brutal institution, both families pay a steep price for their investment. Hansberry's writing of the drama also speaks to the shifting culture of America in the mid-20th century, or what Manning Marlborough calls the Second Reconstruction. The writing of the play coincides historically with the movement from a world of separate but equal to the painful battles for civic inclusion through blood-stained lunch counters, sidewalks, and churches. Inasmuch as the civil rights movement functions as a return to the unfinished business of emancipation, Hansberry's play speaks to her time, her current time as it does to the past. In a journal entry she noted about the time, some scholars have estimated that in the 3 centuries that the European slave trade flourished, the African continent lost 100 million of its people. No one, to my knowledge, has ever paid reparations to the descendants of Black men. Indeed, they have not yet really acknowledged the fact of the crime against humanity, which was the conquest of Africa. But then, history has not yet been concluded, has it? With a name that anticipates the setting of Toni Morrison's Beloved, The Sweet Plantation emphasizes the brutality of slavery through the relative benevolence of its owner, Hiram Sweet. Set on the brink of the Civil War, the beleaguered patriarch questions the futurity of slavery at a dinner with his wife, sons, and family physician. While his son Everett and physician Macon Bullitt think the family needs to modernize the plantation, Hiram wonders, then what happens, Macon, if it's all a lie? The way we live, the things we tell ourselves. Hiram's words echo Hansberry's character Assagai in Raising the Sun. Both men suggest that even in the midst of thinking one is on the right side of history, the contexts that shape our choices may shift, challenging our deepest commitments and rendering one disposable. The Drinking Gourd presents the potential for a world turned upside down through the voice of a patriarch that has lost the power to govern his family plantation, and certainly our current historical moment might give us some insight to think about what does it mean when power structures are being threatened and might feel like they're being rendered disposable in a current historical context, and how that was a similar feeling that animated the Civil War moment. Although challenging some of the institution's governing logics, the Drinking Gourd does not dodge the irredeemable suffering of slavery, but it also does not locate the pain singularly with the bodies of the enslaved. Hannibal explains, whenever you hear your master say about slavery, you always believe the opposite. There ain't nothing hurt slave master so much as when his property walk away from him. Guess that's the worst blow of all. Way I look at it, every slave ought to run off before he die. The play's challenge to what it means to be a master replaces the site of return and therefore remains a trajectory of repair. As an artist activist, Hansberry set ideas and concepts in motion. She animated freedom. The space she creates on stage serves as a site of return, but one that does not presume the stability or relatability of what we think of when we say we know slavery. Instead, she seeks to apprehend how changing locations upset social arrangements, even ones as calcified as those at the heart of such a peculiar institution. Hansberry's work in radical leftist circles positioned her to frame the Drinking Gourd as a challenge to the understanding of slavery as Black people's traumatic legacy, rather than the trauma that organized the Western world. Thank you.
So I'm wondering, so if you could say more in terms of, I love this line, sort of the trauma, slavery as a trauma to the Western world. In part because I've been thinking through in a new course I'm teaching on racial liberalism and law, and what's been striking is that, you know, often we think of sort of the category of white and whiteness and slavery as these categories that say maybe that emerge, say, in the moral realm, a realm that's not necessarily political. But what, you know, Professor Haney Lopez so in his book, White by Law, argues is that, well, if we look at certain cases in the U.S., we'll see that the formation of race was solidified, you know, in the early 18th and 19th centuries, in part by major cases in which African Americans who were phenotypically white were trying to show, look, I have the right to convey my slaves to my descendants, and the judges were like, well, no, you may have fooled people, but based on, so, you know, what you haven't done in terms of your honor, in terms of voting, or based on characteristics that are not necessarily Anglo-Saxon, I'm going to demonstrate that you are not white. And so there's this real intentional effort to try to use science and performance as a way to dictate who isn't in this category of whiteness. And so I want to, can you say more then about how does then this idea of the trauma what does that say in terms of the categories that we hold on to, particularly around whiteness and blackness? Because we often say, well, these categories are they're too rigid. They don't really reflect our sort of nuanced postmodern sort of eye. But it sounds like you're actually sort of pushing that and wanting to say, no, there's some fundamental categories that we have yet to really sort of tease out that reflect the kind of violence you're hinting at.
So I think one of the things that's really interesting about the legal history that you just cited is you see the courts in the 19th century, U.S. courts really wrangling with the contradiction around a fundamental American right to inherit and the property rights that adhere by way of citizenship, and the investment in disenfranchising Black people as inheritors and maintaining racial hierarchies. So the courts have this tension, and I've read about it some in terms of white people who are trying to bequeath things to their Black children, because the courts want to maintain Black people as property and therefore ineligible to property rights, at the same time that they want to maintain white people's ability to bequeath, which are their property rights. And so the courts come down in different ways around this question, but it's a key legal battle because they want to maintain that being American fundamentally means your right to property. And so I say that to say that I think this is one of the ways that we can see race both being concretized, but then also showing some of its complexities when we think about how the family, and so this is often taught in terms of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings as the most famous case of this, but thinking about how family and how we conceptualize family becomes complicated via the institution of slavery. And so I think one of the ways that we might understand this informing what we see as Blackness is, once again, going back to the examples of how Blackness is being rethought in the late 20th century. And so we talk some in the Psychic Hold of Slavery about Pharrell Williams' proclamation that he's the new Black. He has an interview with Oprah Winfrey, and he talks about he's a new Black that's not related to slavery or degradation. He's related to thriving and wealth. And one of the things that's really fascinating about that assertion is how that coheres in his individualism, which is, a primary American mode of identification, but might not translate if he's facing violence by the state. And so even with all his wealth and recognition, there's this way in which his Blackness, as it's being perceived by his phenotype, limits that access. And so that double-edgedness comes up both in popular culture as well as in legal history.
Now, Alfonso, can you say more about this idea of the church as sort of the foundation for creating moral problem of Blackness, and how is the church particularly sort of performing sort of a violence against Black bodies? How's that performance sort of reinforcing sort of this link between, say law and religion in ways that I don't think people have really thought about? Often we see law in one sphere and the church in another, but you're showing how the church is in many ways sort of reinforcing through performance very sort of bad politics and bad legal decisions.
Sure. So primarily I think about this relationship referencing Corey Walker's work, A Noble Fight. In this text, in his definition of democracy, one of the things that he asserts is that in light of the historical experience of African Americans with democracy in this country, that democracy has to be redefined, right? It has to be redefined, and it must, in this redefinition, include experiences of violence and intimidation, right? Because we have not seen the formation of a successful democratic state in the absence of such foundations. I would say that the same is true in the case of the American church. Thinking about this history from the perspective of Black people in America, I think the church has to be redefined as a violent institution, and that violence cannot be sort of understood as accidental or incidental to the church's success and to the church's fundamental identity in America. So I think that on the one hand, utilizing this similar kind of example that's been applied in the sphere of politics, right? I think that same idea is translatable to the field of religion. Additionally, though, as we sort of think about performance, one of the ways in which the problem of violence and anti-Black violence in particular remains fundamentally a religious or theological issue is because many of the nation's leaders are having these ideas reinforced in theology courses on college campuses, right? And following their graduation, right, they matriculate into the various positions of power within the republic, right? Many in state power, many at the federal level. And so these ideas now get put into practice through some of these early college university presidents and leaders, right? But many of them being primarily religious leaders, right? Religious ministers and clergy. And so they're being informed by a particular view of theology that then gets sort of disseminated throughout the remainder of the republic.
So Professor Butler, say more about in terms of how then is this sort of characterizing sort of state violence against black bodies as a kind of religious/moral act? What does it say about the practitioners of American Christianity or religion in general, in terms of what is it doing in terms of what kind of citizen/moral actors, right, are these acts creating? And how do you see, in particular, African Americans sort of respond? How should they respond? It's sort of a normative question, given that so many are either Christian or practice African indigenous traditions.
This is just so complex, and we want to uncomplicate it, and yet we don't want to be reductionistic in the conversation or in how we approach these things. Excuse me. Because, as I see it, the U.S. is grounded in violence, and it was founded on this whole question of freedom and unfreedom. So you have some that are striving for freedom, those that are striving to maintain that there will be a group that would never be free. You have this being moved through an understanding, an ideology that the nation is a Christian nation. And so it becomes complicated because of this separation of church and state idea, this idea that laws are developed to ensure that there will be an unfree population. There is, as we've been talking and thinking about these things, I've recalled Leon Higginbotham's book, Matter of Color, where he documents, looking at state legislature, the number of laws that were put in place to ensure that black bodies would always remain at the bottom, remain identified as property. And so in order to keep this property as property, violence has been one of those modes of operation to ensure that the system remains as it is. I mean, if you just think in terms of how we practice child rearing, it's often through punishment. And you maintain the household structure through punishment. And so the household then gets extended to this plantation idea as a household and a household of faith that gets maintained through punishment. And if you sin, you get punished. And so you have these black bodies that are constantly being punished. And then you have the idea of projecting your negativity out into the world. And once you can project it out into the world, you can control it and you can cleanse your own self. And so all of the negativity gets colorized, gets attributed to black folk, and now you can control it and punish it. And all of this is religious, because religion is all about how you orient yourself to the world, how you orient your activities and your relationships, and how you give meaning and attribute meaning to the life that you live. So I hope I'm getting at what you're asking.
And actually leads to the next point in terms of how would you all then characterize President Obama's sort of eulogy at Mother Emanuel in 2015? Because on the one hand, as I listened to it, I thought it was a remarkable kind of moment, I think, for the nation, sort of that galvanized itself, around, this idea of a violent act against 9 innocent people. But also, I thought it's also kind of tricky in part because it, I think, reduced or eliminated conversations around Christianity's ongoing role, right, in its sort of terror against black bodies. So how does Obama's sort of representation as sort of the president of the U.S. coming in as a kind of sort of priest to console the nation and to console African Americans, and yet at the same time consoling within the context with the very brutal history. So how do we come to terms with that? What appears to be a very kind of contentious or a very tenuous kind of doubleness.
I looked at that less as President Obama's functioning as the priest and more at the moment as this collective response, this cry of grief. Within the African American community, we often identify ourselves as being the most religious and forgiving people in the world. And so that moment I saw as a classic moment of black folks acting in a forgiveness in order to survive. Forgive to survive. And because that's one of the things that was stated that day. We forgive you, Dylan Roof. Well, if you look at the dynamic of forgiveness, it is a relational process. It requires that one confess and request reconciliation, and then the other saying, okay, I will engage in a reconciling process with you. So forgiveness is relational. So when you heard folks declaring that day, we forgive you, that was really a forgiveness in order to survive. And it comes out of, if I act on this rage that I'm feeling, I will kill you. And if I kill you, I make myself even more vulnerable because I'm in a position of not being in power. And so what we saw that day through that experience was forgive to survive. And it wasn't really forgiveness as an outcome.
But does that act of forgiveness also reflect the ongoing terror in terms of, is it actually the threat of violence against black bodies foreclosing the opportunity to exert what one might call sort of human reaction to respond to the violence against them?
It's not foreclosing because it is a process of I'm surviving. And so it becomes this creative moment where I am releasing the rage that I have against you. And you no longer have the power over me in that sense. But that's still not saying you're forgiven. I'm just saying I'm releasing the power that you've exerted over me, and I am claiming life.
But I think that I agree with everything that's been said. And the only thing that I will add is two things resonate in addition from your comment. One is thinking about Obama as representation of the state and how his blackness becomes mobilized to have us in some ways not think about that centrally as him giving a presidential eulogy. Like, what does it mean for him to be the representative of the state, and in some ways extending what we understand as state violence? But then the other piece is it also makes me think about the site of the black church as a site of political organizing, and the 16th Street church bombing as that church being bombed because it was where activists were going to meet. And so it was intentional that children be killed, and not by accident that these young girls were killed on that day. And so what does it mean to target the black church in that civil rights movement moment as a site of organizing, and the terror being taken to what is supposed to be an esteemed part of our culture that is off guards from violence? Which is really thinking about it historically based on what we've just said. And so the last piece I'll say to that, and going to creativity, is we know that after the 16th Street church bombing, Nina Simone wrote one of her most famous songs, Mississippi Goddamn, and she says she writes it to channel her rage because her first instinct is to find a gun, and then her husband's like, what are you doing? And so then she decides to write a song instead. And so it's interesting to think about how artists have responded, and that art is one of the only spaces where Black people are able to express rage in the public context, because in political context, it's almost forbidden for them to appear angry. And we see this in people's responses to Obama and his temperament, and thinking about why he is fit to be presidential is precisely because he's unflappable. And so thinking about the political context for expressing rage, I think is really interesting in relationship to the eulogy.
I'll just add briefly, I also think that to go back to Dr. Butler's point, I don't think you categorized it this way, but please correct me if I'm miscategorizing your statement, but an almost rush to forgiveness could be superficial. I think in many ways, the reason, so I agree, I think that it's motivated by a need to survive. I also think it's informed by a much broader historical context that I referenced earlier when we talk about white rage acting in anticipation of Black retributive violence, the expectation of violence. And so I think that that has something that has shaped Black religious people in particular, has shaped their response to episodes of violence. As in terms of violent reactions, right? Either non-actions or finding other avenues to channel violence. Artistic being one of the sort of primary modes of expression. Thinking specifically about what happened in Charleston and time to Suika's point about performance, I'm reminded of the Childish Gambino song, "This Is America," or the video rather, "This Is America," and you know, at the beginning of the song, you know, is rather upbeat, and you know, aesthetically, right, in terms of its sort of oral qualities, but the visual representation, right, is several scenes of meaningless violence, meaningless gun violence, right? That protagonists portray against Black actors, Black communities, Black people, right? And one scene, right, there's a gospel choir dressed in traditional church robes, and they're singing, you know, a positive song about uplift, right? This is a moment where in the song, you know, the tenor and the tempo has shifted and it's upbeat, and it switches back to the regular tempo of the song when, you know, the artist turns using a gun and just mows down the entire choir, right? And then he goes on to just perform the next verse, and in the backdrop is repeated, "This is America, this is America, this is America." And so we see senseless violence being acted out against Black bodies, but again, you know, where is the opportunity to have, in a political context or even a religious context, genuine dialogue about this phenomenon? So again, I think, yeah, in many ways, arts has become the kind of regulated, accepted space, you know, to kind of echo Suika's point, for expressions of Black rage, and one of the only acceptable spaces.
You named 16th Street Baptist Church, but I would also say that Emmanuel, AME, was selected for the same reason, because of that deeper history of the leaders that came out of that church community during the antebellum period to revolt. So even in the contemporary, there is still targeting because of a history of uprising.
No, and so I wonder then, I mean, do our religious spaces really have the capacity now to handle this contemporary moment of Black Lives Matters, of sort of refocus attention on state violence against Black bodies? Because I think Suika's right. I mean, the one way that even Du Bois dealt with his rage, right, was to write in short stories, in fiction, as a way, because he knew that there was a constant threat. And I find that even in terms of my own personal life as a parent, you often, you have to lie to yourself, because at every moment you run into a police officer or someone in authority, or in authority in terms as an officer, there is this onslaught of fear, right? And there's this constant concern, even how you raise your kids in terms of you want to make sure they're safe. And these are sort of, I think, narratives that most people have no idea you're dealing with. But it's like this constant fear, this constant, it's like Du Bois says, you feel the rage. Like, and I have a question, how does it feel to when you see someone, and the question is, they don't care about your name, they want to know, how does it feel to be a problem? And so I'm wondering, my sense is that it's yes and no, but my fear is that traditional black church spaces that were amazing, right, all throughout history in terms of providing what Higginbotham calls a counter-public space, a place for understanding politics, religion, civic life. I wonder, in light of the role of the politics of respectability, do those places still have not only the space, but the kind of spiritual capacity to deal with the kind of psychic terror that African Americans are living under? Because we're constantly trying to prevent additional violence, so we put on this good face, right? At what point do people actually have a breakdown, or are allowed to have an emotional breakdown to deal with this threat that's always present?
The emotional breakdown has been a part of the life of the church, the black church. I wouldn't characterize it as an emotional breakdown as much as being permitted to actually express yourself emotionally, where it is not criticized, but it is understood, where you are actually cared for. The other panel, there was a conversation, or at least a moment, where they talked about what's going on in Brazil and Candomblé. And when I visited there and watched folks being mounted by the Spirit, it became very obvious that that was one of the ways of really dealing with the tremendous violence that was experienced under that system of slavery. And so we have the same experience here of being under constant threat of death, of being tortured, our bodies being traumatized. And where can we go to release that? It has been within religious spaces. Because if we release it in public, it's always interpreted to be something else, and it's reacted against. And so it's been in those religious spaces that we have actually found our humanity. I mean, that has been one of the major creative moves of the black church, to help black folk to claim human dignity, to claim our humanity. And it's through that interaction, those relationships, because we're told we're not human, we're told we're 3/5 human, we're told we don't matter, we're told we are animals with tails. And so we get together, and it's in those spaces that we say, no, we are not what you say. We are truly human beings created in the divine image.
So just to sort of piggyback on Dr. Butler's point, I'm reminded of the scene from Beloved, where Reverend Baby Suggs leads the community to the clearing, and the clearing being a brush harbor or an outdoor ritual space that typically housed African and African American worship in the U.S. And when she leads the community there, she delivers a sermon, and in the sermon, she essentially reminds them that they have. So she tells them to physically touch and to look at their own bodies, right? Touch your hands, and then she reminds them to love their hands, right? And so for me, at least, this is the origins and foundations of Black spirituality, irrespective, right, of its theological sort of orientation, right? I think it's primarily oriented, whether it takes Christian or Muslim or other religious forms, traditionally African-derived religions. I think the primary role is the revaluation of Black humanity, but I think that has to also, in order for that to happen, the body specifically has to be revaluated, right? So the body is not a commodity, right? It is a vehicle of God's image, right? This vehicle that can communicate love et cetera, and express that in the world.
And I wonder if, because the black church in particular has been sort of this intermediary between sort of the state and black communities, again, given that role, does that role then lessen the richness of their critique? In other words, because I'm finding that people like J. Cole and even Cardi B, someone like, Kendrick Lamar, they're providing a kind of insight into the pain that I'm experiencing, or the pain that I hear my students experience, in ways that I don't necessarily hear on Sunday, in part because the preacher is always trying to, make sure these forces don't get out of control. And so in doing so, you lose a certain kind of passion, right? Whereas the truth telling that I'm hearing from the artist is actually quite remarkable.
So I think that the church has the capacity to have this type of truth telling, and certainly historically there have been different ebbs and flows of that. I do think that it's interesting to think of the church both as local gatherings and then as an institution, and what we might think about larger questions around institutionality. As many of you probably know, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was an organization, a civil rights organization that was founded with the particular interest in not lasting forever. So they were not building an institution to last forever. They were building an institution to solve a particular problem in the South during the civil rights movement period. And so it's interesting for me, at least, to think about what does it mean to be invested in institutions lasting forever, like a particular church. When do institutions, perhaps they need to be reinvigorated or reformed or rethought, and when are they still serving their purpose? But one of the challenges of the Black church, in my opinion, is the ongoing history in America of patriarchy and how that can create exclusion around questions of respectability. And so the artists that you just named are able to provide different representations of Blackness that also then allow different modes of expression. And I do think that the church has to wrestle with its history with patriarchy, and it has to wrestle with its history with homophobia and what that might mean for our truly liberatory politics, and also what Black people's own investment in heteronormativity, given the ways that the Black family has been used to police and integrate Black people from slavery to the present. And so that's not to say that, traditional families or nuclear families are a problem in and of themselves, but if we think sociologically in relationship to history, we can deduce that sometimes they are being deployed as a mechanism to police Black people in ways that might not be fruitful if we're thinking communally.
So I'd like to open it up for the conversation to you, the audience. So we have a question here.
Hi, that was just fantastic. I really appreciate this. Thank you. I have kind of a theological question, and it may be based on some ignorant premises. So it strikes me as a non-Christian, Andrew March, Belfer Center at Harvard's Kennedy School. So it strikes me as both a non-Christian and also as a non-sort of expert in Christian theology, that Christianity is sort of based on two potentially paradoxical premises with regard to violence. One, that violence is the normal state of affairs, that the world is built on violence, the world is built on suffering. The foundation of Christianity is based on the acknowledgement of violence against the body, against about the sort of the existence of unjust rule, the existence of tyranny. So the normal state of affairs in the world factually is violence. From the normative standpoint, however, violence is always the exception. So there's no, I don't want to say no, but so the idea of using violence in terms of exercising moral agency, exercising religious agency, is always the other. It's always what Caesar does, it's always what the world does, but it is not the primary way of expressing meaning. There's a possible analogy here to the liberal social contract, which begins with an observation that the world is violent, the world is a jungle, the world is a state of nature, and seeks to address that, but sort of has a myth about its own creation in the world of a non-violent order when, as you said, it's founded on violence. So perhaps the simplifying or sort of ignorant premise is that the way that Christianity primarily deals with violence in a normative sense is as a way of managing or giving meaning to violence being done to oneself, violence being done to so the existence of suffering. So obviously the Black tradition in America is perhaps the most quintessentially Christian experience that you could imagine. But it leaves, and here's the impression, which is that when violence is an option for meaningful political action, for meaningful sort of realization in the world, it strikes me that there's this trope that African Americans are drawn outside of Christianity for that, right? Whether it is sort of Marxist militancy or Islam or something else like this. And as a nonviolent person, I don't have a sort of fetishism around nonviolence. I was wondering if there was any sort of anything to be added to that. So yesterday, actually, on the way to the conference, I made a pilgrimage to Harper's Ferry, and obviously you have this sort of multiracial exercise of Christian violence, but you get this sense of John Brown as the theologian, John Brown as the one reaching into the Old Testament. I don't know if that's true. So anyway, I'm interested in a sort of fuller picture of the ways in which legitimate use of violence as a means of establishing agency, as a means of exercising justice in the world. What is the counter-public, from the theological standpoint, within the Black church and within sort of Black theology?
I mean, I could.
Tiny
I can't. I'm certainly not equipped to answer from a theological standpoint, but from a historical standpoint, I do think that we have lots of figures who are managing the investment, at least during the civil rights movement period, of being the moral high ground in practicing nonviolence as a strategy that was being used against organizations, knowing that there were organizations that were not invested in nonviolence as sort of, if you don't, so for example, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Hansberry was also compared to Malcolm X as sort of this boogeyman who, people were afraid of, but certainly Hansberry and King relied on Malcolm X as a threat to then make them in a position to be able to negotiate with the state. And so the violent option was one that actually enabled certain modes of negotiation. But I think post-civil rights movement period is interesting because violence against Black bodies does not create moral outrage anymore, really post-Rodney King. So then what is the political maneuver given this new visual context?
So I guess my answer would sort of depend on which historical period you refer to when you ask. It's because I think the Black church has a shift theologically. I'd love to be able to pinpoint when this shift occurs, but I would just say, prior to the Civil War, pre-Civil War Black religion, I think, in many ways, espouses maybe not espouses, sanctions violent retribution, and then also provides a religious rationale for that violence. So as early as 1785, John Morant, who's the first ordained Black minister in the U.S., in his autobiography, so as you might imagine, right, as many of you probably can imagine, the Exodus narrative, the Old Testament story of the Exodus functioned centrally in the religious imagination of Black Americans, right? It's a story about the deliverance of enslaved people through the agency or assistance of a divine being, right? So the appeal of this narrative is obvious. So in Morant's narrative, he has an allegory that borrows many of the structural themes from the Exodus story. So, for example, just to highlight a couple, at the beginning of the Exodus narrative, the context is that it's the children of Israel who are suffering, right? So the decree has been issued from the Pharaoh, and the children of Israel, the male infants in Israel are being slaughtered. Fast forward to the end of the narrative, right? And it's the firstborn in the household of Egypt that's the 10th and final plague. That's the plague that finally convinces Pharaoh to release the Israelites from bondage. So we see a reversal of fortunes, right? At the beginning of the narrative, Israel's children are dying. It's the enslaved that are suffering and perishing. By the end of the narrative, right, it's the Egyptians who suffer, and they suffer in many of the same way, right? And I mean, arguably the same kind of way. It's the loss of one's progeny, the loss of one's offspring, the loss of one's future. Morant utilizes these same structures, right? So he depicts a narrative at a Brush Harbor meeting, a midnight meeting held in secret, low country of South Carolina in the wilderness. And these enslaved, he's leading a group of enslaved worshipers, and the plantation mistress has her husband to descend upon them while they're engaged in worship with two of the overseers. The community scatters, many of them are caught, tied, and they're beat savagely, right? And then 2 months following this encounter, Morant says that it pleased the Lord, right, to visit this slave mistress with an illness that no doctor could cure, all right? And she passes away, she dies. Now, given the history of poison in the area, in that area, given the history of Morant's own personal narrative, he's traveled and has had extensive initiatory rituals in the wilderness with both African American and Native American communities. My suspicion, right, is that this is a literary representation of violence, and it's catalyzed or signaled by the appearance of the symbol of blood. Initially, it's the blood of the enslaved that covers the ground, right? And at the end of it, it's the slave mistress's sort of idealized, or not actual blood, but in death. Well, this same type of narrative structure can be identified in a host of what we might call the slave. Now, I think freedom narratives is perhaps a better term to categorize these stories, but in a host of these early African-American autobiographical texts, right? So Nat Turner's Confession also has the appearance of blood that's followed by his own actions of retribution. Frederick Douglass has a scene where he modifies this trope, right? And so I say that to say, I think in a particular moment in the early history of the African-American church, that violence was certainly a legitimate response to violence perpetrated against. I mean, even Frederick Douglass, as late as, interprets the Civil War as the manifestation of Nat Turner's vision, right? This is the battle, the engagement of spirits, black and white spirits that Turner envisioned, right? And so the idea that it is through blood that transformation or revolution, the shedding of blood, the same idea of sacrifice. I think that prior to the Civil War, prior to emancipation, African Americans are taking hold of that idea and utilizing it for themselves. The last thing I'll say is that in Charleston so Morant's conspiracy happens in Charleston, just at the siege of Charleston during the outbreak of the American Revolution. In 1822, Denmark Vesey's conspiracy takes place, and one of the alleged conspirators, informs that Vesey frequently would read from the Exodus story and say that the children of Exodus used something, right? Religion, violence, but they used something to fight against their oppressors to be free. And that Vesey was explicit in saying, it's no sin for us to do so as well. So I think that they're really taking their example from the Old Testament narrative, and in that narrative, violence is fair play.
I really do appreciate you noting that it's important to look at this contextually, look at what specific historical period you're wanting to run this question through. Because as you started, yes, we can say the Bible itself that's guiding Christianity is filled with violence. Bloodshed, 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 massacre, slaughter everything, leave nothing standing. And so that is something that is guiding us, even as we continue to say, well, that was Old Testament. The New Testament is the gospel of love and peace and joy and happiness. But even the New Testament ends with Revelation, which is, again, returning to the Old Testament violence in order to bring about this new Jerusalem, this new world order. But following this, looking very specifically at a context, I think it's important that we do consider what the purpose of the Black church has been on the whole, if we want to generalize. And the Black church in America, I understand it as having the primary purpose of making citizens. So we're coming out of slavery. We are now in Reconstruction, and it is the church that begins to mediate citizenship for the black community. And in order to mediate that citizenship, we are showing, excuse me, demonstrating, because America has the identity of Christianity as a qualification for citizenship, white and Christian qualifications for citizenship. So we become extremely Christian, and the church moves us in the way to say, see, we are true Americans. And we negotiate with that white part differently, but it still is a vehicle for citizenship. Education is seen as one of those modes for moving us into full citizenship. So churches start schools, colleges. And so we come to the civil rights era with this mode of making us citizens and recognizing that there is this violence that is a part of the American system. So we act non-violently, and yet we are also presenting ourselves as the moral high ground, as the sacrifice to bring the nation to a new understanding of what it means to be American. So we hear in King this notion of we are suffering to make America America. I think that's something that we've moved away from as a community, but not necessarily as a church.
And I wonder, are there other sub-narratives that we've also forgotten as we see the church as a citizen-making project, right? And, anecdotally, we know that these preachers are also protected by deacons who have guns, who bring guns to church regularly, who protect the minister. We had the Deacons for Defense in the South, right, during the 50s and 60s. So I do think there are these sub-narratives in which general uses of violence, I think, is taken for granted. But because of the doubleness, double consciousness, or however you want to frame it, people are very much aware of wanting to, again, become a citizen, but recognizing that there are a lot of contradictions. So I do think that as we get more stories, more historians who are looking at these counter traditions, we're going to see a different, a church that's very different. I mean, that's very complicated. Yes, it's citizen making, but legitimate uses of violence, I think, are taken for granted.
Yes, but there are so many churches that are against movements today like Black Lives Matter.
At least publicly. I don't know if internally they actually believe that. I think there's a public stance against it, but I'm not sure what's happening internally reflects always the public rhetoric.
And that's where I would go with, we have to look at it as individual churches. But I would say the overall narrative is, we're sort of holding you at bay. We might support you, but we're not going to be engaged with you to the extent that you are engaged.
Okay. No, great. You had a question? Oh, sorry.
Hi, my name is Antti Pentikäinen, and I come from Finland. I'm now in Princeton, but I'd like to go to Dr. Butler briefly on your two complementary interpretations of forgiveness. One was out of fear, another was releasing this action from yourself, and just referring to, I'm sure you're aware, but Archbishop Tutu's and her daughter's book on forgiveness, where they suggest that it's ultimately the victim's right that to release this action or the perpetrator from their mind. So I would just say that your later interpretation does make sense in their recommendation, and it's part of the Templeton broader project on trying to understand the purpose of forgiveness in these situations. My question comes to, based on my work in Finland, assisting in building up a truth and reconciliation process with our indigenous people who have been subject to colonialization and assimilation and a lot of pain. And between this trajectory of defining truth and moving towards something that you also mentioned as reconciliation and relational process, they come up with the question, a phrase which has struck me deeply, which is our people's right to be healed of intergenerational pain. You spoke a bit about the purpose of art of dealing with it, but that doesn't heal necessarily from it. So I'd like you to speak about this. How would that be possible? Your people's right of become healed from intergenerational pain. without new generations being re-traumatized in it?
My operational definition of healing is being restored to a life of relationship. And so if you are acknowledging that there is the intergenerational pain, you're talking about one community who is identified themselves as the ones who have experienced extreme violence, that could bring about isolation because you have been socialized not to be in relationship. You've been socialized that if you make yourself vulnerable, you are making yourself vulnerable to attack and possible destruction. And so you are changing your understanding of what it means to be in relationship by saying, I'm going to take the risk of being vulnerable and hope that you will also take the risk of being vulnerable, which will then put us back in relationship with one another. That's the inside the community. Now, how do I take that understanding and work with you who has victimized me generationally? And how am I going to be able to trust you that this conversation we're involved in is actually the beginning of a new way of being? Well, it's only going to happen if we maintain relationship, and that's what is going to restore us to have confidence in one another. Because I'm going to keep watching you to see, are you being truthful and honest, or is this just a moment for you to be cathartic, to let out what has been troubling you? Now you can go about your business because you've already made atonement. And so that's why I'm saying forgiveness is a relational process. It's an ongoing working through to healing, being restored to that life of relationship.
I mean, there's just to echo your point in James Baldwin's letter to his nephew at the beginning of The Fire Next Time. He says that in order for America to cure its racial nightmare, that whites and blacks have to come together like lovers. And I think part of what he's alluding to in using that term is this idea of intimacy and trust that's required. And so how one might make themselves vulnerable in a loving relationship, an intimate relationship, in ways one might not in a political relationship. But I think what he's trying to suggest, just echoing your point, is that forgiveness requires that type of vulnerability. And I would also say that I do think there's been some work about art and repair that might be useful in thinking about these questions about how one might put oneself back together, not to get over, but to work through sort of intergenerational trauma. So Josh Chambers-Lutzen has a beautiful essay where he thinks about how art and performance work in these veins.
Also in South Africa, since you did mention Bishop Tutu, where they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there has been an experience, a feeling among many of the Black South African people, the Zulu are the ones I know best, where they're saying, okay, we had this moment of folks coming forward and confessing, but what happened next? They walked away still maintaining their ideas and never really developed a new relationship. So they've been forgiven by the state, and they're walking away now free. And that's why I said about that cathartic moment that they've experienced. Okay, I've said this, it's been a burden upon me because this has destroyed my sense of humanity. Now I've been restored to my sense of humanity because I've confessed this, and I can go on and not ever be bothered by what has happened, and really don't have to be in relationship with you because the state has forgiven me. And so in your process, that is one of the things you have to consider. What was the outcome of what happened in South Africa? It kept them from exploding in terms of ultimate violence, which was one of the things that prohibited apartheid coming to an end. There was always this fear that if they get freedom, they're going to kill us. Okay? It didn't happen. But what was the result?
Jose?
Yes, about this idea of making citizens the trope of the American civil religion, incorporating the excluded right into the covenant. through first the Catholics and Jews, then through the civil rights movement, the blacks. You have this trope being repeated in all the presidential addresses from Kennedy all the way to Obama, the last two Obamas, inclusion of the non-Christians, inclusion of our gay brothers and sisters. And yet very clearly we are in a moment of absolute rejection of this trope of the American civil religion, unabashed white supremacy, not only against violence against black bodies, but by unabashed anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, Latino rapists. So basically it is a unique moment in this context of, if we look at this reflection of what has happened in the civil rights movement. And so how do you see this moment? I mean, what does it mean? The expansion of this that you have experienced always as part of the black experience now being used against every other group and maintaining a kind of a trope of a white supremacy as the only American, and male, obviously white male supremacy. So.
So I guess I should preface this. So optimism has never been my strong suit, and perhaps that's that's a occupational hazard. So I see this moment in a much broader historical context. So in the course that I'm teaching, to orient first-year students, we begin with the year 1492 and sort of talk about its symbolic significance to this history. For most of the students, right, 1492, they associate with the Columbian voyage, right? I share with them that 1492 is also the year, right, that Jews are expelled from Spain, right? And 100 years prior, right, Muslims are also, or maybe I had it backwards, right? But, it happens to get, right? So within this 100-year period, right, and Charles Long makes the argument that in this historical moment, one of the things that you really see happening is this is the formation of European identity, right? Europe comes into existence. It gains its continental identity by excluding people who have ethnic and religious differences. And so while rhetorically in presidential addresses, I think there has been the language or the rhetoric of inclusion, when I just thinking about, Brexit, thinking about bans on Muslim travel. I think that there's really a doubling down on this fundamental interpretation of the origins of America, and to tie it into questions about reconciliation or restitution. My question is to reconcile to what? Restore to what relationship? There's not a historical moment. There's not a moment in the historical contact between African and European peoples in the Americas that I think any person of African descent would want to be restored to. As bad as this is as good as it's ever been, right? And I don't know that it can be much better. And so in terms of the I'll say in terms of how I understand this moment, I understand this moment as another iteration, right, of a kind of vehement expression of white nationalism. And where do we go from here? I think we repeat the same cycles, quite honestly. Fewer, well, maybe, right? In America, maybe. But I think perhaps we're headed down a similar trajectory. This will be the last thing I say. I think the issue is that when we think theologically, right, because of academic silos, we don't think also historically, right? So there is this kind of transdisciplinary approach to how we conceptualize the divine and how we conceptualize our responsibilities to one another as religious persons. In light of that, we don't think historically. I think we think theologically, but theology has been isolated from other forms of inquiry that I think can help us move beyond some of that.
I am in full agreement with you. I guess what I want to contribute to what you've said is when we think about race as a construct. Theologically, it is understood to be an expression of, an exploration of, an attempt to define what it really means to be human. And in America, the human being was first and foremost the European and nobody else. God bless America and nobody else. And so in this sense of we have lost our ground, we have to return to basics, get back to the fundamentals. Getting back to the fundamentals in the US is going back to that basic definition of citizenship, which was grounded in English, white, and Christian. And so with folks saying America has decayed, been corrupted, with a black president, we have to get back to and save the nation. And that means becoming more rigid in our relationships and exclusionary. I mean, we go through these life cycles, we go through this period of asking the question, who am I, who are we? And part of that is answered by declaring who I am not, what I am not. We then revisit that later on in life and we'll reassess, did I make the right choices? Have I made the right decisions? And I think we're at that point in the kind of life cycle. Did I make the right decisions? And they're saying, no, we made some bad decisions. Let's go back to the basics. So.
Well, I think we're actually out of time. So thank you all for let's thank the panelists, please, everyone.